So, how do you measure something as incredibly complex and personal as gender? I mean, that question feels pretty tough today, right? Well, back in the 1970s, one psychologist created a test that didn't just try to answer it, it pretty much changed the entire conversation. Let's get into it. For the longest time, psychology had a really simple answer to this question. The thinking was that gender was basically a single line. On one end, you had pure masculinity, and on the other, pure femininity. And here's the thing, you could only be more of one by being less of the other. It was this very rigid black and white model, and pretty much nobody questioned it. But then along came a psychologist named Sandra Bem, and she looked at that single line model and basically said, hold on, this doesn't feel right. She argued that this way of thinking was just way too simplistic. It didn't actually match up with how people really are. So she developed a tool to prove her point, the Bem Sex Role Inventory, or the BSRI for short. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The big idea at the heart of Bem's work was that masculinity and femininity were not opposites at all. Nope, she said to think of them as two totally separate scales. So a person could be high on one and low on the other, or low on both. And this was the really revolutionary part. She introduced a fourth option. You could be high on both. And this amazing combination, this balance of traits, gave us a whole new category, androgyny. So how did this thing actually work? Well, it was actually pretty simple. You'd get a list of 60 different personality traits, words like assertive, gentle, independent, compassionate. Then you'd rate yourself on each of those traits using a 7-point scale, from never true of me all the way to always true of me. And based on how you answered, the test would calculate separate scores for masculinity and femininity, which would then sort you into one of 4 groups. And here they are, the 4 classifications. So you could be classified as masculine or feminine, which, fits that traditional idea. But the BSRI also gave us these 2 other categories that completely broke the mold. You could be androgynous, scoring high on both scales, or you could be undifferentiated, scoring low on both. You can see how this was a massive departure from that old binary. For its time, the BSRI was just a huge leap forward. So it's really important to get why it made such a splash. Let's take a look at its biggest strengths and what it really brought to the table in psychology. Okay, first and foremost, you really can't overstate how much of a game changer this was. I mean, before Sandra Bem, psychology was completely stuck on this one-way street. The very idea that you could even measure masculinity and femininity as 2 separate things, well, that just wasn't part of the conversation at all. And that's the real key here. Bem's work literally forced a major shift in thinking. By shattering that old binary, the BSRI created a much more flexible, more inclusive way to think about gender. It made room for all sorts of individual variation. And in doing that, it basically opened the door for the much deeper conversations we're having today about non-binary and fluid gender identities. It was the spark that started a whole new field of research. And this really gets to the heart of that shift. You can just picture it. The BSRI took psychology out of a world of these rigid, stereotypical boxes and pushed it toward a more inclusive understanding, one that finally started to recognize the messy, complex, beautiful reality of who we are. But look, a revolutionary idea isn't quite enough in the world of science. For the BSRI to really be taken seriously, it had to prove it was a legit scientific tool, right? That means it had to be both valid, which means it measures what it's supposed to measure, and reliable, meaning it gives you consistent results. And for its time, the BSRI pretty much checked both of those boxes. So, to make sure it was valid, the scale was created with input from a big panel of 100 judges. But just as important was proving it was reliable. And researchers did that with follow-up studies that showed what we call test-retest reliability. In plain English, that just means if you took the test and then took it again a few weeks later, your results would be pretty much the same. That consistency showed that, for its era, it was a solid, stable tool.
Okay, but let's be real. No tool is perfect, and the BSRI is absolutely a product of its time. As decades have passed, some pretty significant criticisms have popped up, and they really highlight its limitations in our world today.
Probably the biggest knock against the BSRI is that it just hasn't aged all that well. The fancy psychological term for this is that it lacks temporal validity, which is just a way of saying its relevance has really faded over time. I mean, think about it. This test was made over 50 years ago. The traits that people considered stereotypically masculine or feminine back in the 70s, they're not necessarily what we think today.
Our whole society's ideas about gender have just shifted so dramatically. And because the BSRI is literally built on those outdated stereotypes, it's now seen as culturally biased and, frankly, not a very useful measure of gender identity in the 21st century.
All right. The second major criticism, well, this one goes even deeper. It actually questions the entire foundation of the BSRI. What if gender isn't just a collection of personality traits that you can add up and score in the first place?
Yeah, a lot of modern thinking says that gender is a social construct. So what does that mean? It means it's not just some simple list of traits you're born with, but something that's deeply, deeply shaped by our culture, our history, our society. And if you look at it from that perspective, trying to boil something that complex and personal down to a 7-point scale, well, it's not just simplistic, it kind of misses the whole point.
So it's flawed. It's outdated. Does that mean we should just toss it in the history bin? Not at all. Not even close. Despite all its limitations, the BSRI left behind this incredibly powerful and lasting legacy that we are still feeling today. Them's work gave us this really powerful idea. She argued that the psychologically healthy person is the androgynous one, someone who's able to be both independent and tender. This was really the heart of her argument, that true well-being wasn't about cramming yourself into a neat little gender box. Instead, psychological health was all about flexibility. The most adaptable, healthiest people were the ones who could draw from a full range of human traits, no matter what the situation called for.
And really, that's the bottom line here. The Bem Sex Role Inventory is definitely not the gold standard tool it once was. But its real importance was never about the answers it gave or the boxes it put people in. Its true legacy is the fact that it smashed that old rigid binary to pieces. It started a new, way more complex and way more honest conversation about what gender is and how we can even begin to understand it.
So the BSRI was a tool from the past that helped create our present. It's a great reminder that the ways we try to understand ourselves are always changing, always evolving. And it leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? Bem's test opened a door for all of us. The question now is, how do we keep pushing that door open and continue exploring the vast, rich, and diverse landscape of what it means to be human today?